The gun was already cocked when Sarah Keller pressed it against the stranger's chest. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing about grief. It had a way of burning away all the soft edges of a person, leaving something that looked almost like courage, but was really just the hollow space where fear used to live. She had been awake since 3 in the morning, sitting in the dark kitchen of a farmhouse that was not quite hers anymore, listening to the night settle around her like a verdict. And then she had heard boots on the porch, heavy boots. A man's boots. "Who are you?" she said. It was not a question. The man on her porch was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested hard years, not idleness. He had the kind of face that had been rearranged by life more than once, a jaw that had probably been broken and set wrong, a scar that cut through his left brow with the clean precision of a knife rather than a fall. His hat was dark with trail dust. His eyes, catching the pale moonlight that bled through the porch slats, were the exact gray of a sky before a storm that means it. He did not reach for the iron at his hip. He looked down at the barrel of her rifle where it pressed against the worn leather of his coat, and then he looked back up at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not amusement, something else. Something quieter and more complicated than either. "My name is Isaac Garner," he said. "I bought the Morrison place. The Morrison place. The 40 acres of dry grassland and broken fence posts that shared a boundary line with her property on the eastern side. She had not known it sold. Nobody had told her. In this part of New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1878, news traveled slow when it was the kind of news that might unsettle a woman who had already been too unsettled. "You bought it," she said. "Signed the papers in Santa Fe 3 weeks ago." He reached into his coat slowly, the way a man does when he knows a gun is trained on him and he wants to remain alive, and produced a folded document. He held it out to her. "I thought you could use a good neighbor." She stared at him, at the document, at the absolute nerve of a man who showed up on a widow's porch in the middle of the night with a deed in his hand, and said something like that. As though the word neighbor was a simple thing. As though it did not carry the full weight of everything she had lost in the past 8 months. Everything she was still trying to hold together with cracked hands, and a will that was growing thinner by the day. She lowered the rifle, not because she trusted him. She did not trust anyone. But because the document was real. She could see the territorial seal even in the moonlight. And because the gun was getting heavy, and because something in the way he was standing there, patient and still, reminded her unexpectedly and painfully of a man she had loved and buried in the spring. "It is the middle of the night," she said. "My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I walked the rest of the way." He glanced down at his boots. "I did not plan the arrival." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway and said, "There is a barn." "I appreciate that." She watched him walk toward the barn in the moonlight, leading the limping horse by the reins, and she stood in the dark doorway of the farmhouse that was slowly killing her with its silence and its debts, and she told herself that she felt nothing about this whatsoever. She was lying to herself. She had been doing that for months. Her full name was Seraphina Keller, though she had gone by Sarah since she was 4 years old, and her mother had decided the whole name was too much work. She was 28 years old. She had come west with her husband Daniel Keller 7 years ago, full of the particular kind of hope that makes young people do enormous and irreversible things. They had driven a wagon from Missouri to New Mexico territory with everything they owned, and a map that turned out to be only approximate. And they had found this land, 110 acres of it, with a river that ran cold in summer and a soil that was hard but not unkind. And they had decided it was theirs. They had worked it together for 6 years. They had built the farmhouse board by board, caulked the windows against winter, coaxed wheat and corn and sorghum out of the resistant ground. They had lost a pregnancy in the second year, and Sira had grieved that in the private and ferocious way of women who are not permitted to stop working long enough to grieve properly. They had no children. They had each other and the land, and a dog named Copper who had died of old age the previous winter. And then in March of 1878, Daniel Keller had ridden to the town of Millhaven for feed and flour and had not come back. They had found him 2 days later in a dry creek bed 4 miles from town with a bullet in his back. Nobody knew who had done it. The sheriff in Millhaven, a man named Harold Vess who wore his badge like a man wearing a costume, had conducted what he called an investigation and concluded it was probably drifters or possibly Apache raiders, though there had been no raids in that area in 18 months, and drifters did not typically take nothing from the men they killed. They left Daniel's horse. They left his wallet. They left everything except his life. Sira had buried him in the pasture near the elm tree where they used to eat their lunch on hot summer days. And then she had gone back inside and made herself supper and eaten it standing at the window because she could not bring herself to sit at the table that still had 2 chairs. 8 months later, she was still trying to hold the farm together on her own. She had a hired hand named Robbie who was 16 and cheerful and meant well and had broken 3 tools already. She had a mule named Patterson who was brilliant in the field and impossible everywhere else. She had debts. The mortgage note held by the Millhaven Farmers Bank, which was not as sympathetic an institution as its name suggested. And she had the land. And she had a stubbornness that had been her defining characteristic since childhood and which currently constituted her primary asset. She had not, until this particular October night, had a neighbor. In the morning, she went to the barn and found Isaac Garner asleep in the hay with his hat over his face, and his horse standing beside him in the manner of an animal that has found the one person in the world it does not mind being near. She stood in the barn door and studied him with the same pragmatic assessment she gave to anything that arrived unexpectedly on her land. He was older than she had thought in the dark. Probably 35, maybe a few years past that. There was gray at his temples that the trail dust had hidden last night. His hands, even in sleep, were the hands of a man who had done serious physical work, scarred and broad and brown from sun exposure. There was a rifle in the hay beside him and the handgun at his hip and a knife at his boot. He was armed the way only men with dark pasts or dark expectations traveled, and either one of those things should have made her more cautious than she currently was. She said his name once. He was awake immediately, not startled, but instantly present in the way of men who had trained themselves out of the vulnerability of deep sleep. He sat up, moved the hat from his face, and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that appeared to be assessing and retracting information at a rate she found slightly unsettling. "Morning," he said. "I make coffee at 6, she said. "If you want some before you go, you are welcome to come to the kitchen door." A pause. "Before I go, I assumed you would be moving on to your property today. I will need to pull the shoe from my horse's hoof and clean the wound before I ride anywhere." He said it simply, without apology, the way a man states a fact that does not require permission. "I would not put it past a day." She looked at the horse. The animal's left front leg was held slightly elevated, which even she could see was the sign of a sore hoof. She was not going to argue with the horse's condition. "Coffee is at 6, she said again, and walked back to the house. He came at 6. He sat at her kitchen table, the table with 2 chairs, and drank 2 cups of black coffee and did not say much, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He looked around the kitchen with the quiet attention of a man cataloging things, and she found herself cataloging him in return. The way he held the mug, two-handed, like it contained something worth being careful with. The way he looked out her window toward the fields and did not look at the photographs on the wall, which meant he had already noticed the photographs and decided not to ask about them. "Your eastern fence is down in 3 places," he said eventually. She stared at him over her own mug. "I know that. The post nearest the dry gulch has rotted through completely. You will need a new one before the first real frost or the whole line will follow." "I know that too," he nodded, drank his coffee, said nothing else. When he left to tend his horse, she stood at the window and watched him go and felt the kitchen close around her like it always did when there was no one else in it. That specific and grinding silence that had been her constant companion since March, and she thought, a good neighbor. He had said it like it was the simplest thing in the world. She spent the rest of the morning on the north field with Robbie, turning the last of the autumn soil before the ground hardened. Robbie was a good-natured boy from a family in Millhaven with 6 children, and no surplus of work, and he came to her farm 3 days a week for a wage she could barely afford, and did everything she asked without complaint, and several things without being asked, and always seemed slightly astonished by her knowledge of the land, as though women were not supposed to understand soil composition and water tables, and the particular stubbornness of sorghum. "There was a man in the barn this morning," he said, carefully, in the way of someone who is curious but aware they are on uncertain ground. "He bought the Morrison place," Sarah said, driving the hoe into the earth with a force that perhaps exceeded strict agricultural necessity. "Oh," Robbie said, he thought about it. "Is he a farmer?" She paused. She actually did not know. "I did not ask." Robbie thought about that too. "He looked like a gunfighter," he said, and then immediately looked alarmed that he had said it, glancing at her face to see if he was about to be reprimanded. She did not reprimand him, because he was right, and she was already thinking the same thing. Isaac Garner spent the day in her barn with his horse. At noon, she brought him bread and salted pork, because that was what she had, and because leaving a man to go hungry on her property felt wrong regardless of who he was. He thanked her with the genuine and slightly unused manner of a person who was not accustomed to being looked after, and she went back to her field without lingering. By late afternoon, his horse was sound. She watched him saddle up from the kitchen window. She was not watching him specifically. She was merely looking out the window in the general direction of the barn, which was a thing she had a right to do, and she watched him lead the horse out into the yard and stand for a moment looking at her fields, at the broken fence along the eastern boundary, at the house. And then he looked at the window where she was definitely not watching him, and she stepped back from the glass. He rode out toward the Morrison place without saying goodbye, which was the correct thing to do and which somehow annoyed her anyway. The Morrison place. She was already thinking of it as Garner's place without having decided to, was in worse shape than her farm, which she considered quite an accomplishment in the direction of disrepair. The farmhouse had been empty for 2 years since old Cyrus Morrison had died intestate, and the territory had spent that time arguing over the property before finally auctioning it to whatever cash buyer appeared. The barn had lost part of its roof. The well needed clearing. The fencing was not merely down in places, but had achieved a state that suggested its original construction had been approximate. She knew all this because she had ridden that boundary line twice in the past year, partly out of habit and partly out of the formless dread that the empty neighboring land produced in her. The sense that the wilderness was always waiting to take back what humans thought they had claimed. She did not ride to check on Isaac Garner. She had enough of her own problems. And yet, 4 days after his arrival, she came out in the morning to find her eastern fence repaired. Not partially repaired, not the haphazard stopgap measure of a neighbor doing a minimum courtesy. The whole line, from the dry gulch to the creek bend, had been walked and shored up. The rotted post had been replaced with fresh-cut timber that she could identify from the Morrison, from Garner's woodlot. The wire had been stretched and staked correctly, with the kind of understanding that the work required more than muscle, but a knowledge of how fence behaved in different soils and temperatures. She stood at the edge of the property and looked at it for a long time. It was not a small thing, that fence. It represented 2 days of work, maybe more. She had not asked him to do it. He had done it without announcement, without any apparent expectation of acknowledgement, and she was not sure what to do with that. She rode to the Morrison, to Garner's place. He was on the roof of his barn with a hammer, replacing damaged shingles with the focused efficiency of a man working against time before the weather turned. He heard her horse and looked down. He did not stop working. "You fixed my fence," she said. "Your cattle would have been in my fields by the first hard frost." "I do not have cattle." A pause. He drove in another nail. "Your mule, then. The fence needed doing." She sat on her horse and looked up at him and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite gratitude, and was therefore the specific and confusing mixture of both that she had been feeling since he arrived. "You should have told me you were going to do it," she said. "I would have helped." He stopped working then. He looked down at her with an expression that was difficult to read at this angle and with this light. But she thought it was something like surprise, genuine, unguarded surprise, which was interesting on a face that otherwise looked like it had been specifically designed to reveal nothing. "All right," he said. "Next time I will tell you," she nodded. She turned her horse to go. Then she stopped. "I have an apple pie cooling on the window," she said, to the air in front of her rather than at him directly. "If you come by this evening before the light goes, you could have some." She rode back without looking up to see his expression. She thought she heard the hammer stop and then start again. She chose to interpret that however she liked. He came at 6. The pie was good. She was a good cook, partly by inclination and partly because Daniel had been a man who noticed and appreciated food, and she had kept cooking well even after there was no one to notice it for. Partly out of stubbornness and partly out of the vague superstition that the moment she stopped caring about small dignities was the moment the larger ones would follow. They ate at the table with 2 chairs, and she poured him whiskey from the bottle she kept in the cabinet above the stove, the bottle she had barely touched since March, and he drank it with the same 2-handed carefulness he gave to coffee, and they talked, not about the important things. Not yet. They talked about the land, soil, and water rights, and the irrigation ditch that had partially silted up at the north end of both their properties. He knew more about irrigation than she expected. He knew more about a lot of things than a man of his appearance and manner might suggest. Soil science, crop rotation, the specific challenges of high desert farming at 4,000 feet elevation. She found herself drawn forward in her chair without noticing it, the way you lean toward a fire for warmth without making a conscious decision. "Where did you farm before?" she asked. Something changed in his face. Not much, the minimum adjustment of a man who had long practice in controlling his expressions. "I have not farmed before," he said. She stared at him. "You know a great deal about it for someone who has not done it." "I have read a great deal about it." She considered this. "Why New Mexico?" "Why now?" He looked at his glass. He turned it in his fingers. "I needed to do something with my hands," he said finally. "Something that produced something instead of the other thing." She understood, without being able to say precisely how she understood, that this was as much of an answer as she was going to get on that subject tonight, and that it was actually a great deal more than he gave most people. The other thing, she said, keeping her voice neutral. I have done a number of things in my life, he said, meeting her eyes, that I am not proud of. I am not proud of them in the specific way that means I am trying not to do them anymore. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in the directness of that admission, its lack of self-pity or self-justification, that she found unexpectedly affecting. She had known men who boasted about dark pasts as though darkness was a credential. She had known men who lied about dark pasts as though the lie could unmake what the darkness had done. She had not before encountered a man who simply named the thing and sat with the naming of it. "Are you running from something?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she knew it. Out here, direct questions about a man's history were not always wise. But she asked it anyway because she had a right to know, given that he was living next to her, given that whatever he was running from might arrive at her door. He did not flinch from the question. "There are people in this territory," he said slowly, "who would prefer I was dead. That is not the same thing as running. It is fairly similar from where I am sitting. The difference," he said, "is that I am not planning to keep moving. Whatever comes, I will meet it here." She did not know why that settled something in her, but it did. The willingness to stay. After 8 months of everyone in her world either leaving or dying or both, there was something in the simple declaration of intention to remain that worked on her like medicine. They sat for another hour. When he left, he said, "Thank you for the pie." He said it the way he had thanked her for the bread, genuine and slightly unused, and she watched him ride back through the dark toward his broken-down farm, and she thought, "Here is a man carrying something enormous." She thought, "Here is a man who is trying to put it down." She thought, "I know exactly what that feels like." October moved into November, and the high desert performed its annual transition from beautiful to brutal with the characteristically minimal warning. Frost came hard on the second night of November, which was earlier than usual, and it took out Sierra's remaining kitchen garden and frosted the grass down to iron and made the morning smell like cold metal and possibility, which was the contradictory nature of autumn in that country. Isaac Garner arrived at her farm on the 4th of November with a wagon. Not his wagon, a rented one from Millhaven, loaded with lumber and hardware and 4 bags of flour and 2 of sugar and a half-dozen other provisions that she had not ordered and had not asked for. He pulled up in the yard looking defensive about it in a way she had not seen from him before, braced, as though expecting to be told no. "I went to town for my own supplies," he said. "I noticed yours were low." She stood on the porch steps and looked at the wagon and felt the complicated emotion that had become her primary mode of experiencing Isaac Garner, that impossible combination of touched and infuriated that she could not seem to resolve into one feeling or the other. "I can buy my own provisions." "I know you can. I charged everything on a tab at Patterson's store, and I can give you the bill and you can pay me back whenever you want to or not at all. I did not say it was charity. I said I noticed your supplies were low." She stared at him. "How did you notice my supplies?" "I was in your kitchen 3 times. I have eyes." That was, she had to admit, difficult to argue with. She came down the steps and looked at the wagon bed. He had bought exactly what she needed and nothing she did not, no extravagances, no gestures, just the basic arithmetic of a farm kitchen in early winter. Flour, sugar, dried beans, coffee, salt pork, a tin of baking powder. "There is also window glass," he said. "Your north window has a crack that will let in the cold." She had been stuffing the crack with rags since September. "How much do I owe you?" I wrote it all down. He produced a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and handed it over. She looked at it. The figures were neat and correct, and there was no premium added for the delivery, just the store prices, copied accurately. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. "Help me carry it in," she said. They carried it in together. He installed the window glass while she put away the provisions, and the sound of him working in the next room, the quiet focus of it, the absence of unnecessary noise, was the first time she had felt the farmhouse as anything other than a container for silence since March. Robbie arrived for his work day in the middle of all this and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen staring at the strange man putting window glass in his employer's north window. He looked at Sarah with huge eyes. "That is Isaac Garner," she said. "He is fixing the window." Robbie processed this. "The neighbor." "Yes." Robbie looked at Isaac. Isaac looked at Robbie with a brief, assessing glance and then returned to his work. Robbie sidled up to Sarah at the counter and whispered, with the subtlety available to a 16-year-old boy, "He looks the same as before." "People generally do," she said. "I mean," Robbie whispered more urgently, like a gunfighter. "Go tend the mule," she said. Robbie went to tend the mule, glancing back twice. That evening Sarah made a full supper. Not pie this time, but actual supper. Beans and cornbread, and the last of a smoked ham she had been rationing. Isaac ate at her table, and she sat across from him. And they ate like two people who had been eating across tables from each other for years, which was an entirely false impression, since they had known each other for approximately 2 weeks, and which she noticed and filed away as information about herself. "You know people in Millhaven," she said. She had been thinking about this, some. "The sheriff there is a man named Harold Vess." His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The quality of his attention shifted, became more careful, more specific. "I know the name," he said. "You know him personally." A pause. "We have crossed paths." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and looked at the table's surface rather than at him, choosing her words. "My husband was killed in March," she said. "Back road 4 miles from Millhaven." Nobody was held accountable. Vess ran what he called an investigation. He told me it was likely drifters. And you do not believe it. Daniel had $40 in his wallet. They left the wallet. They left his horse. They took nothing. She looked up. It was not drifters. Isaac was very still. "What do you think it was?" "I think someone wanted Daniel Keller specifically dead. I think Vess knows who, and I think he was either paid to look the other way or was involved in the looking away before the fact." She said it plainly, without drama, because she had been sitting with this particular truth for 8 months, and it had worn down to something hard and clean. "I think it has something to do with the land. The land. Someone has been trying to buy this farm since before Daniel died. A man named Clement Drury. He sends letters through a lawyer, the same letter, essentially, every 6 weeks. He owns the Millhaven Farmers Bank. He holds my mortgage note." She paused. "He has been increasing the pressure since March in a way I find interesting." Isaac sat forward. His forearms came to the table. She noticed, irrelevantly, how large his hands were. "How much is the note?" $420. "I am current on the payments. He cannot foreclose legally as long as I remain current." She looked at Isaac steadily. "But I am not certain he will always wait for legality." "No," Isaac said, very quietly. "I imagine he will not." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was a recognition in his face, not surprise, but something darker and more personal. "Do you know Clement Drury?" she said. Isaac picked up his coffee cup. Put it down without drinking. "Tell me more about him," he said. She told him what she knew. Clement Drury had arrived in Millhaven 6 years ago, established the bank, and had spent the intervening years acquiring land and influence in a pattern that was not uncommon in the territory, but which was being pursued with unusual systematic aggression in this case. 3 other small farms in the area had sold in the past 2 years. 2 of them to men who, as Sierra heard it, had not originally been planning to sell. The third was an elderly widow who had been visited by men she described as polite but frightening. As Sierra talked, she watched Isaac's face. He listened with complete attention, the kind of listening that absorbs and processes and connects, that is not merely being polite. By the time she finished, his expression had settled into something that she could only describe as resolute. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You do not have to. I think I do, given what you just told me." He looked at his hands on the table. "I was a marshal for the territory for 10 years more or less with some gaps." She had been expecting something, but not this. My last case was a man named Hardened. Land fraud and extortion in the Colorado Territory. I built the case over 2 years. He was convicted and sent to Yuma. He paused. Clement Drury is Harmon Drury's younger brother. The family pattern is not a coincidence. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the grass with the low, constant sound of something breathing. "You knew about Clement Drury when you came here," she said. "Not angry yet, but close." "I knew he was operating in this territory. I did not know the specifics until you told me just now." He looked at her directly. "Sierra, I bought that farm because I needed somewhere to be. I chose this area because I had information suggesting it was where Clement Drury was active, and because I believed a man like that needed watching. I did not know about your husband. I did not know about you." She sat with that. "But now you do. Now I do. And the people who want you dead would also be connected to the Drury family, yes." He said it without flinching. "I am telling you this because you have a right to know who you are living next to and what that might bring to your door." Sierra set down her coffee cup. She looked at this man across the table, this hard-edged, gray-templed former marshal who had shown up in the night with a lame horse and a deed and an apple pie courtesy that masked something much more complicated. And she thought about the fence he had fixed, and the window he had glazed, and the supplies he had brought, and the way he sat at her table, like it was a place worth sitting. "Is that why you fixed my fence?" she said, "and brought my supplies? Was that surveillance?" Something crossed his face that looked genuinely like pain. "No," he said, "that was because the fence needed fixing and you needed supplies. How do I know the difference?" "You probably do not," he said. "Not yet. I would not expect you to." He met her eyes and held them, and this was one of the moments she would think about later. The honesty of it, the absolute refusal to offer her something comfortable that was not also true. "But I am asking you to give me the opportunity to show you the difference. Not because of Drury, because of everything else." She looked at him for a long time. The wind pressed against the new window glass he had just installed. The lamp between them threw warm light across the table between their coffee cups. "I am going to bed," she said. "But I want you to come back tomorrow and we are going to talk about Clement Drury in detail and figure out what needs to be done." He nodded. He stood, put on his coat and hat. "Isaac," she said. He stopped. "I am glad the fence needed fixing," she said. She watched him ride out into the dark, and then she stood with her back against the closed door for a moment, her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. And then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time before she slept. The next weeks were a different kind of living than any she had done before. They met most mornings, either at her kitchen or occasionally at his, which was becoming something more habitable with each passing week. He had repaired the stove, cleared the chimney, replaced the broken porch boards, and done it all with the same systematic efficiency he brought to everything. They talked about Drury. They mapped out what they knew. Isaac had information from his time as a marshal, and she had 8 months of close observation of a community operating under pressure. and together they assembled something that looked like the shape of what Drury was doing. He wanted the water rights. That was the core of it. The river that ran through Sierra's property and through the Morrison, through Isaac's land, was the main water source for the eastern farmlands in that region. Control it, and you controlled the farming. Control the farming, and you controlled the food supply for Millhaven and the surrounding communities. This was the kind of patient, ruthless calculation that Harmon Drury had used in Colorado, and that his brother had adapted and refined in New Mexico. Daniel Keller had, Isaac confirmed from what she told him, been in the process of formally registering the water rights to their portion of the river when he died. He had been in Santa Fe once and was planning a second trip. The registration had never been completed. That is why, Sierra said. She said it very quietly, sitting at her table with the map between them, and Isaac sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and did not look away from her face while she understood it. He was killed to stop the registration. Yes, Isaac said. And Vess. Drury owns the bank note on Vess's house, based on the records I had access to. He paused. Bought it through a third party 2 years before your husband was killed. She sat with that for a moment, the specific grinding machinery of it. The patience it required to arrange a man's death so carefully. The cold, complete disregard for what that death would do to the people left behind. I want to prove it, she said. Not just know it, prove it and make sure Drury faces what he did. That is what I intend to do, Isaac said. With your help, if you will give it. You have my help, she said, and meant it with the whole of the quiet fury she had been carrying since March. But the case building was not the only thing happening in those weeks. Because, between the maps and the documents and the conversations about water rights law, there were other things. There was the evening Isaac's stove chimney caught fire and she came running across the winter fields when she saw the smoke, and they spent 2 hours in the cold dark putting it out together, and afterward stood in his yard flushed and soot-marked and slightly shaking with the adrenaline of it. And he looked at her in the firelight of his smoldering chimney and said, "Are you all right?" And the way he said it, the weight he put on it, made it mean more than the obvious question. There was the afternoon she found him sitting outside on his porch step in the early dark of December, not doing anything, just sitting, and something in the set of his shoulders told her enough that she sat down beside him without asking why, and they sat in the cold together and watched the stars come out one by one over the desert, and he told her, without her asking, about the thing he was not proud of. He had been a good marshal for most of his career. He said this without vanity. It was simply the accurate statement of a man assessing his own history. But there had been a case, 5 years before, where a man he had been chasing had taken a family hostage, a farmhouse family outside Taos. In the standoff that followed, decisions had been made, his decisions and the decisions of others, and the result had been that the man had been stopped, but a member of the family had not survived the stopping. A woman, he said. He said it like it cost him. Her name was Mee Hollies. She was 32 years old. She had 2 children. Sierra sat beside him in the cold and did not say anything reassuring, because she had enough respect for him to know that what he was carrying was real and that false reassurance was an insult to real weight. She said, "Is that when you left the Marshalls?" "Not immediately. I stayed another 3 years, but I left myself somewhere in that farmhouse and I could not quite find where." He looked at the stars. "When the Drury case finished, when Harmon went to Yuma, I thought I would feel something resolved. I did not. And then you came here. And then I came here, to put my hands in the ground and grow something." A pause. "And I found you instead." She turned her head and looked at his profile, the broken jaw, the scarred brow, the complicated lines of a face that had survived too much, and was now trying something gentler. "You did not find me instead," she said. "You found me in addition." He turned and looked at her then, and the distance between them on the cold porch step was small enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the winter air, and she thought very clearly, "I could love this man." And then, with only a beat's delay, "I think I already am." She stood up. She pulled her coat around herself. "Come to supper tomorrow," she said. He said, "I will." She walked back across the winter fields in the dark with her heart beating something urgent and complicated against her ribs. And she did not try to talk herself out of it or into it, because she had learned in the past 8 months that arguing with large truths was a waste of the limited energy she had. She allowed herself to feel it. She held it carefully, like the new window glass, something that could keep out cold and let in light but had to be handled gently. December brought snow, and with the snow came an escalation of the situation with Clement Drury that made the months of pressure look like a polite prelude. One of Drury's men. She recognized him, a wide-shouldered enforcer named Tolliver who made regular appearances in Millhaven with the specific studied casualness of a man being paid to make his presence felt. Rode past her property 3 times in 1 week. Just the road, just riding, never stopping, never speaking. But slow, deliberately slow. The second week of December, she received a new letter from Drury's lawyer. The language had changed. Previously, the letters had offered to purchase the farm. This letter offered to renegotiate the mortgage note, extending the timeline, reducing the monthly payments, in exchange for the formal signing over of the water rights to a corporation the lawyer named as Western Land and Agricultural Holdings, which Isaac, when she showed him the letter, identified as a shell company he had seen connected to the Drury family in Colorado. "He is changing tactics," Isaac said. He was at her kitchen table with the letter spread between them, and his face had the particular focused quality she had come to associate with him working through a problem. "He cannot foreclose legally, and apparently the direct pressure has not worked, so now he is offering a deal that looks reasonable on paper." "It is not reasonable," she said. "If I sign away the water rights, the land is worthless within 10 years. Yes. But most people do not see that immediately, and Drury relies on it." She wrote back through the lawyer, declining politely and without explanation, and then 2 days later 3 of her fence posts were pulled out of the ground. Not the eastern fence Isaac had repaired, the northern line, the one closest to the road. Pulled cleanly, suggesting tools and intention rather than accident or weather. She did not need to tell Isaac. He was there when she found them, coming over to help her with the irrigation ditch repair they had planned for that morning. And he stood looking at the posts, lying in the frozen mud with an expression that was not quite anger, but was the thing that comes before anger in a man who has disciplined himself out of immediate reaction. "We need to report it," she said, "to Vess. I know." She looked at the fence. "I know it will do nothing, but there needs to be a record." "I agree." He paused. "I will come with you. I can go alone." "I know you can," he said. "I would rather you did not have to." They rode to Millhaven together. The sheriff's office was a low adobe building on the main street with a horse outside that needed its shoes replaced, and a shingle above the door that had been cracked and never mended. Harold Vess was inside at his desk, a broad man going to fat, with the particular bland face of someone who had made a long practice of giving nothing away. He looked up when they came in. His eyes went from Sarah to Isaac and stayed on Isaac for a moment longer than necessary with the quality of a man trying to place a face and not quite managing it. "Mrs. Keller," he said. "And Isaac Garner," Isaac said. "I bought the Morrison place." Something crossed Vess's face. "Brief. Gone." "What can I do for you?" Sarah described the fence posts. Vess wrote it down with the deliberate, unhurried penmanship of a man performing bureaucratic thoroughness. He asked a series of questions that were technically the correct questions and emotionally completely hollow. He said he would look into it. "We would appreciate that," Isaac said. His voice was even and pleasant and contained underneath the evenness something that made Vess shift slightly in his chair. "Promptly, if possible." "I do my best," Vess said. He was looking at Isaac with the specific wariness of a man who has recognized something he was hoping he would not encounter. "Garner, you say. You are not from around here." "I live here now," Isaac said, and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that was a message. They rode back in the cold, clear air of a December afternoon, and somewhere between Millhaven and the farm the horses fell into step beside each other, and she looked over at Isaac and found him already looking at her, and she thought, "There is nowhere else I would rather be riding." She thought, that is information. Christmas came and went quietly. She had not celebrated it the previous year, had not been able to, had sat alone in the farmhouse with a candle and what she called her best face and what was actually her most controlled face. This year was different. She was not going to attribute the difference entirely to Isaac Garner, but she was not going to pretend it had nothing to do with him either. She made a proper Christmas dinner. He came with a bottle of good whiskey and a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. And when she opened it, there was a book inside, a volume of Dickens, one she had mentioned in passing that she had always meant to read, in a conversation she had not expected him to file away. She looked at the book. She looked at him. She said, "Thank you," and it came out quieter than she intended. He said, "I thought you might want something to read in the evenings." They ate Christmas dinner, and he read to her afterward from the book, because it turned out he had a good reading voice, steady and expressive without being theatrical. And she sat across from him in the lamplight and let herself feel the fullness of the evening without apology. In January, Tolliver the enforcer came to her door. He came in the morning while Isaac was working his own land, and he came alone, and he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, in a performance of courtesy that did nothing to disguise the nature of what he was actually doing. He told her that Mr. Drury had asked him to deliver a personal message. He told her that Mr. Drury had enormous respect for Mrs. Keller's determination, but was concerned that her situation, alone, winter, significant debt, was not sustainable, and that his offer of assistance remained open and was offered in genuine goodwill. "Tell Mr. Drury," Sierra said, "that I am not alone and that my situation is entirely sustainable." Tolliver looked around at the farm, at the evidence of recent work, at the horizon in the direction of the Morrison place. Something calculated moved behind his eyes. "Mr. Drury understands you have had some company recently," he said pleasantly. "He hopes the company does not cause you more problems than it solves." She understood this as the threat it was. "Good day, Mr. Tolliver," she said, and closed the door. She went directly to Isaac. He listened to the account of the visit with the same focused stillness he brought to information about the case. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He knows who I am." "I think Vess told him." "Yes." He stood. He walked to the window of his kitchen and stood looking out at the land. "This is going to move faster now. He was content to pressure you slowly because he had time and you had no support. Now he knows you have support, which means he will feel urgency. Men like Drury do not like urgency. It makes them clumsy." He turned from the window. "But clumsy men with resources are more dangerous than careful ones. What do we do?" "I have been in contact with the Federal Marshal's office in Santa Fe," he said. "I have sent them everything I have on Drury. They are moving slowly. They always move slowly, but they are moving. What I need is local evidence. something that ties Drury directly to what happened to your husband." She was quiet for a moment. "There is a man," she said. "A man who was at the Millhaven saloon the night Daniel was killed. He told the bartender something. I heard this from a woman in town, second-hand, maybe nothing. But he said he heard two men talking about the Keller property on the road that afternoon. He said one of the men was Tolliver." Isaac went very still. "Who is this man?" "His name is Frank Osby. He has a small claim south of town. He did not speak to Vess because he said Vess and Tolliver drink together." Isaac nodded slowly. "Will he talk to a federal representative?" "I do not know. He might talk to me. I met him once at the general store. He seemed like a decent man who was frightened of the wrong people." "Then I think," Isaac said carefully, "that you should talk to him." She went to Frank Osby's claim on a Tuesday morning, alone, because she thought Isaac's presence would alarm a frightened man. Frank Osby was in his mid-40s, a quietly weathered man with a careful face and work-roughened hands, and he answered his door with the particular wariness of a person who had been expecting a kind of trouble he hoped would not come. She told him who she was. She told him about Daniel. She told him what she needed. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. He said, "Mrs. Keller, those are men who know where I live." "Yes," she said, "I know. I have a son in Santa Fe," he said. "I have been meaning to visit." "That might be a good time to write down what you heard and sign your name to it and send it by post to the federal marshal's office." She met his eyes. "The post comes and goes from Santa Fe, not from Millhaven. No one at the Millhaven post office would ever see it." He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "The man with Tolliver was not a man I had seen before, but he had a brand on his left hand, a circle brand like a cattle brand but on skin. I have never seen the like." She filed this away. She thanked him. She rode back to the farm and told Isaac. "A circle brand on the hand," Isaac said, and the way he said it, the recognition in it, made her look at him sharply. "You know what it is? There are men in this territory," he said carefully, "who work for the Drury family in a specific capacity. Not officially. They are employed through front companies and they handle things that Drury cannot handle through legitimate means." He paused. "We called them the Circle in the marshal's office. It was not an official designation. It was what we used." She absorbed this. "So the man who was with Tolliver on the road the day Daniel was killed was one of Drury's direct operators." "It would appear so." His voice was controlled in a way that she recognized as the effort required to hold something large and heavy in place. "That is direct evidence of Drury's involvement. If Osby will testify combined with the financial records I have, it is enough. He will sign a statement. He may or may not testify. A signed statement, if credible and corroborated, may be sufficient." He paused. "I have a contact in the territorial marshal's office, a man I trust. His name is James Aldred. I have been corresponding with him. I think it is time for him to come here." She nodded. "Write to him tonight." "I will." He looked at her across the kitchen. Outside, the January wind was steady and cold against the walls. "Sierra," he said, "yes. I need you to know that whatever happens with Drury, whatever comes of this, it is not why I am still here." She looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I want to be sure you know it." "Isaac," she said, and something in her voice made him stop. She could feel the room between them, the distance across his kitchen table, the lamp on the wall, the cold wind outside, and she thought, "I have been careful for months. I have been so careful." And she was tired of being careful about this one particular thing. She stood up and walked around the table and stood in front of him, and he was very still, and she put her hand on his face, the side with the scarred brow, the broken jaw, and held it there. "I know it," she said again, quietly. He put his hand over hers. "Just that." And they stood like that in the cold kitchen for a long moment, and then he turned his face into her hand in a gesture so unpracticed and genuine that it undid something in her chest that had been knotted for a very long time. She kissed him. He kissed her back with a careful reverence that was completely at odds with every aspect of his hard exterior, and completely in keeping with every aspect of the man she had spent these months learning. And the cold kitchen felt for a moment like the warmest place in the world. He pulled back first. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, very quietly, "You are going to have to be patient with me." "I know," she said. "You are going to have to be patient with me too." "I think we can manage that," he said, and she laughed, actually laughed, the full unguarded kind she had not done in almost a year, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both. James Aldred arrived from Santa Fe in the third week of January, a lean, sun-baked man in his 50s with a federal marshal's badge and the permanently assessing eyes of a career lawman. He arrived quietly at Isaac's place rather than in Millhaven, which was the correct precaution. He spent 2 days reviewing everything Isaac had assembled. On the second day, he rode out to Frank Osby's claim himself, alone, with a copy of his federal credentials and the specific manner of a man who had spent 30 years convincing frightened people that the law could be trusted when it was the right law backed by the right people. Osby signed a sworn statement. The statement described overhearing a conversation between Tolliver and a man matching the description of one of Drury's known operators, a man named Cole Harron, who was in the federal records as connected to the Drury family's Colorado operations, in the Millhaven saloon on the evening of March 14, 1878. The conversation included a reference to the road between Millhaven and the Keller property and included the words, "It has been handled, and the water rights will be uncontested now." Aldred looked at that statement for a long time. Then he looked at everything else Isaac had assembled and said, quietly, "This will hold." The arrest of Clement Drury and Harold Vest took place on a Thursday morning in February 1879. Aldred did it cleanly, with 2 additional federal deputies he had brought from Santa Fe, and he did it in the middle of the main street of Millhaven, where it could not be obscured or adjusted or made to disappear. Tolliver was arrested the same morning at his boarding house. Sierra was not present for the arrests. She was at her farm working, which was where she was for most mornings. She found out when Robbie came sprinting across the north field at 11 in the morning to tell her the federal marshals were in Millhaven, and that the sheriff's office was being cleaned out, and that the whole town was standing in the street watching. She put down her tools. She stood in the north field in the February cold and looked at the sky over her land, pale and enormous and clear, and she thought about Daniel, buried under the elm tree to the south, and she said his name once under her breath, and let the grief and the justice of it move through her at the same time, because they were not incompatible, those 2 things. Isaac came that evening. He came with a bottle of wine, which was an extravagance and a deliberate one, and she met him at the door, and they stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. "It is not over," he said. "The trials will take months. Drury has lawyers. There will be complications, I know. But the note on your mortgage, Aldred has the financial records. The bank will be under federal review. The note will almost certainly be renegotiated through the territory's oversight process." He paused. "Your farm is safe." She looked at him. She thought about saying something equal to the weight of the moment and could not find it, so she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I am making supper." He came in. He opened the wine. She made supper, and he set the table, and they ate and talked, and the evening was ordinary in the way of evenings that contained something extraordinary just under the surface, the particular glow of a life that is becoming something you want it to be. After supper he said, "I have something to tell you." She looked at him. She had learned to read the quality of his hesitations. "Aldred wants me to come back," he said, "not to the Marshals permanently, but to consult on the Drury case through the trial. He says my knowledge of the family's operations is essential." She absorbed this. "How long?" "He says 3 months, possibly 4. He looked at her steadily. "I told him I would think about it. I wanted to talk to you first." She sat across the table from him and thought about 3 or 4 months without Isaac Garner on the other side of the eastern fence, and found that the thought was significantly worse than she would have predicted even a month ago, which was information about the speed of things she had not expected. "You should do it," she said. "It needs to be done properly." "Yes. Santa Fe is not so far. Aldred's letters found you here in a week. I imagine mine would manage the same." Something in his face did something that she had come to think of as his equivalent of a full smile, a small movement, almost nothing, that was somehow more affecting than a theatrical expression. "I imagine they would," he said. "Go to Santa Fe, finish this." She looked at him across the table. "And come back." "You do not need to ask me to come back," he said quietly. "There is nowhere else I am going." He left for Santa Fe in the first week of March. Before he left, he stood in her yard with his packed horse and looked at the farm and then at her. And she looked at him. This man who had arrived in the middle of the night with a lame horse and a deed and the most improbable sincerity she had ever encountered. And she thought about how different March was this year from last March, and what a violent and unlikely mercy that was. "I repaired the south fence yesterday," he said. "I noticed. The north pasture gate needs a new hinge. I left the hardware by the barn." "Isaac," she said, "I am going to be fine." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I know you are." He said it with the specific conviction of a man who has seen someone face real things and knows their quality. "That is not why I am telling you about the hinge." She laughed. He mounted his horse and rode toward the road, and she stood in the yard and watched him until he was a small figure against the desert distance. And then she went back to work. The months he was gone were full. That was the thing about a farm. It did not respect absence or grief or longing. It simply required what it required without pause or accommodation. Spring work came early and came hard. Planting, irrigation, the constant battle with a north field that had a water table problem she had been working on for 2 years, and which chose this particular spring to express its full personality. Robbie came 4 days a week now, and she had hired a second-hand part-time, an older man named George Hendricks, who had 30 years of farming knowledge and a comfortable wordlessness that suited the work. She and Isaac exchanged letters. His letters were precise and informative about the case, the lawyers Drury had retained, the legal challenges being mounted, the weight of evidence that was, as Aldred had predicted, holding. And they were also something else, something that existed between the lines of the practical paragraphs, in the particular attention to detail about her farm that told her he was holding it in his mind the way you hold something you want to come back to. He told her he had been reading the Dickens book she had given him at Christmas. She had given it back to him when he left, because it was his, and that it was very good, and he thought she should read the next one after, and he would bring it when he came. She wrote back about the farm, the north field, Robbie's improved performance. He had broken only 1 tool this month, a personal record. The Mule Pattersons continued diplomatic immunity from all reasonable expectations. She wrote about spring, the desert coming back to itself after winter, the first green in the fields, the river running high with snowmelt. She wrote, in the last paragraph of her fourth letter, that she thought about him sitting at her table when she made coffee in the mornings, and that the chair across from her was still there, but the room had a different quality of empty now than it had last year. She did not need to explain what she meant by that. She had discovered that the excellent thing about corresponding with a man who listened carefully was that she did not need to explain everything. His reply to that letter arrived on a warm morning in late April, and she read it on the porch steps in the sunlight. He wrote that he thought about her kitchen every morning, too. He wrote that the chair he was sitting in Santa Fe was adequate in all respects and deeply unsatisfying for reasons that had nothing to do with the chair. He wrote, near the end of the letter in his careful, neat handwriting, "I have been thinking, Sierra, about the eastern fence line, about how the Morrison property and your land share a boundary that has always seemed to me like a line that did not need to be there." She read that paragraph twice. She sat on the porch steps in the April sun and read it twice, and then she set the letter in her lap and looked at her land, all of it, the fields and the barn and the elm tree to the south, and the line of the eastern fence that Isaac had repaired in October with fresh-cut timber, and she thought, yes, that is exactly right. She wrote back that afternoon, and she did not wait to read it over 3 times before she sent it. She wrote, "I have been thinking the same thing. Isaac Garner came back from Santa Fe in the middle of June. Clement Drury's trial had concluded the previous week with a conviction on multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Harold Vess had taken a plea arrangement in exchange for testimony. Tolliver had received 7 years at Yuma. Cole Harron, the man with the Circle brand whose presence on that road in March 1878 had been the central evidence of the case, was being tried separately, and Aldred expected a conviction. She knew he was coming. He had written the date. She had not told herself she was doing anything particular about it, but she had baked bread and changed the kitchen curtains, and told Robbie and George they were not needed that day. She was in the north field when she heard his horse on the road. She straightened from her work and looked. He rode through the gate and across the yard and stopped his horse near the barn and got down and looked up and saw her standing in the north field, and the distance between them was perhaps 100 yards, and they stood like that for a moment. She in her work clothes with her hands dirty from the field, he dusty from the road. And then she walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they met somewhere in the middle of the yard. He looked different, not wrong different, more settled somehow, as though something that had been braced in him had been allowed to rest. He looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "The north field looks better." "I fixed the water table problem," she said. "I know. You described it in your letter. It took 4 weeks and more work than I care to admit. I should have been here to help," he said. "You were where you needed to be." She looked at him. "Is it done?" "It is done." She nodded. She reached out and took his hand, the right one, the larger one, the one with the old knife scar across the knuckles, and held it, and he looked down at their joined hands and then back at her face. "You said something in a letter," he said, "about the eastern fence." "I did." "I have been thinking about how to ask you something," he said, "and I have concluded that thinking about it at length has not produced an approach I consider elegant, so I am going to ask you directly." She almost smiled. "That sounds like you, Sierra." He held her hand in both of his in that 2-handed careful way he had, the same way he held a coffee cup, like it contained something worth being careful with. "I love you. I have been trying not to love you since approximately the 2nd week of October, and I have failed consistently. I would like to, if you are willing, make the Morrison property and your property one property, and the Morrison house and your house one house, and my life and your life one life." He paused. "In whatever order and at whatever pace seems right to you." She looked at him. at this man who had shown up in the dark with a lame horse and a document, and said something so simple it had turned out to be enormous. She thought about every morning for the past 8 months, every supper at the table with 2 chairs, every evening when she had allowed herself to want something she was not sure she deserved to have. She thought about Daniel, buried under the elm tree, who had loved her well and completely and who was not here, and she held that loss and this moment at the same time and found that they were both true at once, the grief and the love, the ending and the beginning. And that was the actual nature of things, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Yes," she said, "in that order, at whatever pace." She tightened her hand in his. "And Isaac, I love you too. I have been trying not to since approximately the 2nd cup of coffee." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled her toward him and held her with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, his arms around her, and her face against his coat that smelled of horse and trail and the particular clean cedar smell that was simply him, and she held on. They stood in the yard of her farm in the June sun for a long time. They were married in August. It was a simple ceremony performed by a circuit preacher in the Millhaven church, not a large church and not a large gathering, because Sarah had not wanted large. Robbie was there, and George Hendricks, and Frank Osby, who had driven in from his claim looking scrubbed and solemn and genuinely pleased. James Aldred had sent a letter and a bottle of excellent whiskey, which Sarah considered a better wedding gift than many flowers. She wore a dress she had made herself in the 2 weeks before, blue cotton with white trim, which suited her better than anything more elaborate would have. Isaac wore a good suit he had acquired in Santa Fe, and which fit him like a suit that had been bought for a man who was not entirely sure suits were his natural habitat. He looked at her when she came down the church aisle with George Hendricks on her arm. She had asked George because he was steady and kind, and because it felt right, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to know as his true face, stripped of all the careful control, just open and direct and present. They said their vows with the preacher and the small congregation and the August light coming through the church windows, and when the preacher said Isaac could kiss his bride, Isaac kissed her with the same reverence and care he had given everything between them, and someone in the small gathering made a soft sound of approval, and Robbie, who was 17 now and considerably less subtle than he believed himself to be, wiped his eye with the back of his hand. They had a small celebration at the farm afterward. The combined farm, which had absorbed the Morrison 40 acres and was now 150 acres, the fence between them pulled down and the land sewn together, and they sat outside in the August evening with their guests and the whiskey, and a very good pie that Sarah had been preparing for a week, and the desert went from gold to rose to purple around them, and the stars came out in their millions over the New Mexico territory. After everyone had gone home and the night had settled in around the farm, Sarah and Isaac sat on the porch together in the dark, side by side, the way they had sat that first time in December when he had told her about Mee Hollies and his years as a marshal, and the thing he had been trying to put down. He had his arm around her, and she had her head against his shoulder, and the farm was quiet around them with the particular deep quiet of a place that is at rest. "I keep thinking I am going to wake up," he said, not to anyone particularly, just to the night. "You are not going to wake up," she said. "I know." A pause. "I know, Sarah." The autumn of 1879 settled into the farm like it was coming home. They worked the land together in the deep rhythm of 2 people who had found their measure in each other. His strength and her knowledge, his patience and her precision, his willingness to be taught and her capacity to learn new things from a man who had read every agricultural text available in the Santa Fe library. They expanded the irrigation system across both properties. They began planning a proper cattle operation for the following spring. Nothing large, a dozen head to start, but enough to diversify the farm's income beyond crops. They repaired the Morrison farmhouse, which was now Isaac's workshop and a proper additional storage space, to the standard of something meant to last. Robbie turned 18 and Sarah and Isaac gave him a full-time position and a modest increase in wages, because he had grown into exactly the kind of thoughtful and capable young man the work required, and because both of them felt strongly that good work should be recognized. In November, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She told Isaac in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, standing at the stove with the coffee already made, and she said it plainly because that was how she said most things, and she watched his face. He stood completely still for a moment. Then something happened to his face that she had never seen before, something that cracked through all the composure he had spent his entire adult life building, purely and completely undone by this single piece of information. And she crossed the kitchen, and he held her with the kind of complete grip that expressed what he could not yet find words for. When he pulled back and looked at her, his eyes were bright in a way that embarrassed him and that she loved completely. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well? What do you need?" "Coffee," she said, "and to stop being looked at like that." "I am going to look at you exactly like this for the rest of my life," he said. "I know," she said. "I said stop, not that I disliked it." Their son was born in July of 1880, on a hot afternoon when the desert shimmered with heat, and the river ran low, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He came healthy and loud and very clearly already opinionated, which was appropriate. They named him Daniel Isaac Garner, Daniel for the man buried under the elm tree who had loved this land first, Isaac for the man who had stayed to love it second, and whose middle name he would carry. Isaac held his son for the first time with the same two-handed carefulness he gave to everything that mattered, sitting in the bedroom chair while the midwife cleaned up and Sarah lay in the bed watching him. And the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen in her life. Pure, undiluted wonder that a man who had spent so long in the territory of dark things could arrive at something this bright. "Hello," Isaac said to his son very quietly. "You have a good farm, I want you to know that. Your mother built it." Sarah closed her eyes and let the afternoon light fall warm across her face and thought, "Yes, this is it. This is exactly it." Daniel grew into a boy who was loud and curious, and had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes and absolutely neither of his parents' patience, which they agreed must have come from somewhere else entirely. He rode his first horse at 3. He asked his first completely unanswerable question at 4, and then continued at an undiminished rate. He followed Isaac around the farm with the absolute conviction of a person who intends to inherit something and wants to understand all of it, and Isaac explained everything to him with a thoroughness that Sarah found completely characteristic. In the spring of 1882, Sarah had a miscarriage. It was early, but it was a loss, and she and Isaac held it together in the way they had learned to hold hard things. Directly, without pretending it was something other than what it was, giving grief its proper weight and time. In the autumn of 1883, their second child was born. A daughter this time, and they named her Me. Not Me Holly's, whose death was Isaac's carried weight, but Me because it was a good name, and because the naming of it felt like something being honored rather than something being buried. She arrived with red gold hair that neither parent could account for, and an expression of serene assessment that she maintained through most of her infancy, studying the world with the careful eyes of someone who intended to take it seriously. Daniel, who was 3, regarded his sister with the philosophical ambivalence of a child who has been the center of a world and is now expected to share it. He came around. It took approximately 2 weeks, and the discovery that she would watch him perform tricks with a gratifying attentiveness. The farm grew. They added the cattle operation, then a second rotation of crops, then expanded the irrigation to include the full river frontage of both properties. Isaac designed a new barn properly, with drawings and measurements and a structural logic that the original barn had entirely lacked. And he and Robbie and George and 2 additional men from Millhaven built it over the course of a summer. And it stood solid and right against the sky in a way that suggested it intended to be there for a very long time. In 1885, James Aldred came to visit for a week, retired from the federal marshals with a creaky knee and an excellent sense of humor, and he sat on their porch in the September evenings and told stories about Isaac's time as a marshal that Isaac visibly wished he would not tell but which Sarah found completely delightful. Aldred looked at the farm, at the fields and the cattle and the children running through the yard and the solid barn and the house with its mended windows and its welcoming kitchen. And he said to Isaac, on the last evening, with the simple directness of an old friendship, "You did a good thing here." And Isaac looked at Sarah, who was coming across the yard with Daniel at her heels and me riding her hip, and said, "Yes, I did." There were days still when Sarah walked to the elm tree in the south pasture and stood beside Daniel Keller's grave and talked to him the way she always had. She told him about the farm, about the children, about Isaac, about the north field that had finally, after years of work, achieved the water table equilibrium it had always been refusing her. She did not pretend that the grief was gone, because it was not gone. It was simply contained in its proper place, part of the whole of a life that contained many things, joy and loss and labor and love, and the specific deep satisfaction of land that knows who is caring for it. She told him, one April morning when the first green of spring was coming up through the still cool ground, that she thought he would have liked Isaac. That was not a small thing to say, and she meant it completely. She thought Daniel would have liked the fence repair, the window glass, the supplies bought and billed so carefully, the way a man who had been made hard by difficult years chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to be something else. That evening she came back to the house and found Isaac reading to the children on the porch, the Dickens book, which Daniel was now old enough to follow with focused attention, and which me was ignoring entirely in favor of attempting to disassemble a pine cone. And she stood in the yard and watched the 3 of them in the late light and felt the fullness of it without trying to contain or qualify it. Isaac looked up from the book and saw her standing there. He kept his place with his finger. He said, "There is coffee." "I know," she said. "I made it. Are you coming up?" She came up the porch steps and sat beside him in the chair she had pulled there herself 3 years ago, the 3rd chair she had added to a household that had for too long had only 2. And she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her without moving his eyes from the page. And Daniel listened with his father's focused attention. And me successfully removed 2 sectors of pine cone and held them up with enormous satisfaction. "Where were we?" Sarah said. "Chapter 7, Isaac said. "Read," she said. He read. The Hardened drifter had bought the farm next door. He had said he thought she could use a good neighbor. He had been so exactly and precisely right that the understatement of it was still, all these years later, one of her favorite things about him, that a man who had turned out to be everything could announce himself as merely adequate. She told him this sometimes, when the evenings were quiet enough for that kind of conversation. He always said, with perfect seriousness, that he stood by the original assessment. He had been a very good neighbor. And she would laugh, the full, unguarded kind, and he would watch her laugh with the expression she had learned to read as his version of complete joy. And the farm would breathe around them in the dark, and the children would sleep, and the stars would burn above the desert, and all of it would be exactly and entirely enough.